Good evening, everyone. Beautiful day here in Fresno, and we're very happy to have with us our guest speaker, Dr. Hakem Al-Rustom, who's coming to us from the University of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he says we're lucky because we're 8 weeks ahead of Michigan, so their spring doesn't come for another 8 weeks. Was it snowing in Ann Arbor? So he's enjoying our beautiful weather. I said this is our best time of year. Enjoy it for the next maybe 2 weeks. No, it gets too hot. Anyway, welcome everyone. I just want to remind you that next Friday, our Kazan visiting professor, Dr. Talin Sujan, who's there in the back waving, yay Talin, will be giving the third in her three-part series of presentations, and this will be called Kept with Care, Letters from Purgatory, and it's her three-part series. The last one was on the postcards, first one was on the letters of Serpik, and this will be on another set of letters. And this is going to be back in the Smith Camp Alumni House where she's had her first two presentations. That will be on Friday night, which means you don't need the parking passes, permits, anything like that. So make sure that you come out, tell your friends about it, and it's going to be very interesting. We'd like to hear her final presentation in this. So Dr. Hakem Al-Rustom is just coming out with a new book, which is called Enduring Erasures, Afterlives of the Armenian Genocide. And he explores the question of what does it mean for a people, the Armenians, to be transformed from indigenous inhabitants to foreigners in their own homeland. It's a very interesting question. He's going to explore it. I'll let him talk about it. He's going to also include the concept of what's called denativization as his approach to what is happening to the Armenians undergoing this transformation in Turkey. Of course, he's going to talk about it today. He is the Alex Manoogian Professor of Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Some of you know Dr. Ronald Suni was the first holder of that chair. And Dr. Al-Rustom is an assistant professor of history and of anthropology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's the author of the forthcoming book that I just mentioned, and he's also the co-editor of Edward Said, A Legacy of Emancipation and Representation. So we're very happy that he's here with us today to share his knowledge and his insight into a really important topic. Let's have a round of applause for Dr.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for a very generous introduction and hospitality. I really am happy to be here. First time to be in Fresno, first time to speak about my book. So it's a really special occasion for me. So I will invite you on a journey into the afterlives of the Armenian catastrophe, the genocide, as what I call denativization. And my talk is going to be around my forthcoming book, in which I explore how Armenians who remained in Turkey after 1950 negotiated their presence as Turkish citizens, and how this challenges the way we see and understand the assumptions about genocide and about survival. I'm always asked about, why am I working on this? What's my relation to the subject topic? And but like many Armenians in the diaspora, I'm half Armenian on my mother's side, and I also grew up with stories that are very fragmented. They were never complete. We know that my grandfather's father escaped the genocide from Mardin, what we call in Arabic Mardin, and we are left with such fragmented stories coming from Mardin. Where is Mardin? Near Diyarbakir, escaping the genocide, and that is the kind of heritage I have. Like Hari Harutyunyan speaks about this as in terms of the way our heritage is unspoken, and that is what got me into this. But also this particular project, as I grew up half Armenian in Cairo, Egypt. What got me into this particular research was I was about 700 feet from Hrant Dink when he was assassinated in Istanbul, and instead of meeting him, I ended up attending his funeral. So when I attended the funeral with all the chants, we are all Armenian, we are all Hrant-Dink, I felt, kind of an urgency. Why did the question of being Armenian in Turkey still spark such violence and such fear? And also, as many diaspora Armenians, we didn't know that Armenians remained in Turkey. We thought that Armenians were either killed in the genocide or survived in the diaspora. So in a way, it was, in a way, trying to answer so many questions. So this is some of the background story. And so that is the book that I've been working on for around a decade. And I want to explore, before I start, or at the beginning of my talks, to start with three main terms that I use throughout the book that are, I find, very important for us to understand what the afterlives of genocide is. The three terms are, that's Hrant-Dink. Difficult, but that's what got me into this project. So it still sparks a lot of tears. So the first one is denativization as a term to understand afterlives. In the book I use the term afterlives to describe the ongoing effects of the Armenian genocide that extended far beyond the official end date of the genocide. So rather than treating 1915 as a closed chapter, Afterlives captures how violence, erasures, and denials set in motion during that time continue to shape the everyday realities of Armenians, whether through altered family histories, loss of language, forced migration patterns, or the way people negotiate identity and belonging today. Even the simple fact of our diasporic presence here today is a legacy as an afterlife of the Armenian genocide. So in a way, we are all living in the future of the genocide. As Saadia Hartman speaks about the future of slavery for African Americans. One of the central forms these afterlives take is what I call denativization, the process by which survivors and their descendants were rendered foreigners in their own home. The book examines how this process persists through daily discrimination, destruction or repurposing of Armenian churches and homes, silencing of Armenian presence in public spaces, and the enduring refusal of the Turkish state to acknowledge the truth of what happened. Denativization is not a historical footnote, it's an ongoing structure that continues to this very day, to alienate Armenians from the land they call home. The second approach is storytelling. And here I rely on the Native American writer and novelist Leslie Marmon Silko, whose people survived annihilation and dispossession. Silko once noted that in Pueblo culture to which she belongs, people construct identities through storytelling. For Pueblo people, individual identity is expressed by telling stories, both of pride and of shame, about what is important to the community to which they belong. Such relational belonging is also practiced by many Armenians when they express their belonging by telling stories of their parents' and grandparents' villages as their own, regardless of their distance from the places temporally and geographically. So I became an Armenian from Mardin when I was doing fieldwork, just because everyone around in Paris when I was doing fieldwork at the time would identify with the village or city of which their Armenian parents came in pre-genocide Anatolia. So when we speak in the plural and present tense, we are from Van, we are from Mardin, we are from Dikranagert or Diyarbakir. It makes the statement always true and makes it speak of the present. Armenians speak of affiliation, identification, and belonging as articulated, experienced, and communicated and shared through stories. Silko says, these stories are always bringing us together, keeping this whole together, unquote, regardless and despite of the fragmentation and dispersal. When one Armenian tells another that they belong to the group of Armenians who came from one or another specific Anatolian locale, the listener reciprocates by telling their own from story. Through this exchange, they create a larger story about our common origin and the shared experience of loss, despite the fact that we come from different Anatolian locales. Experience is told and retold. Relatedness, as well as similarities and differences, are woven through the process of telling stories about being an Armenian from a specific locale in Anatolia. In this sense, storytelling is not about communicating facts and exchanging information that is accurate. Rather, through the shared experience, storytelling creates a meaning about one's present by detouring to the past as a path of survivance in the midst of the loss and destruction that many Armenians continue to bear to this day. The third term is survivance. Survivance is an active and continuous process of living, remembering, and creating in the face of erasure. It builds on the Native American scholar Gerald Vizinor's concept of survivance, which combines survival with resistance, emphasizing presence over absence and story over silence. Rather than being cast solely as victims, communities assert their presence through language, cultural practices, and storytelling. Survivance refuses disappearance. It challenges the structures of denial by insisting on continuity, on dignity, and creative expression. By telling stories, preserving traditions, and forging new ways of belonging, people transform the burden of the past into a source of agency in the present. Taken together, denativization, storytelling, and survivance form the conceptual core of the book. So let's see how they work together through a story of a woman from Sassoon that I call in the book Huri. In chapter 3 of the book, I focus on the life stories of 3 survivors or descendants of survivors. That's the table of contents of the book, and that is chapter 3. One of them is Huri, an Armenian from Sassoon who lives now in Istanbul. I first met her at the Armenian church in the Gedik Pasha district of the city. As soon as we met, she told me, "My own heritage is dying. The Armenian dialect of Sassoon too is slowly being forgotten." She was recording the speech of older Sassoon Armenian women who had left their villages because she feared the unique words, the local worldview, might vanish. Many of these words related to the genocide in ways that standard historical terms that we use, like genocide, cannot capture. One day we met in Biyazit in a Simit Sarayi cafe. She spoke about the fact that her village described the events of 1915 with the word ferman, a Persian word meaning imperial decree used in Ottoman Turkish. The villagers, she says, identified the 1915 genocide as ferman, reflecting the conviction that it was an order given by the government of the time. When I asked Huri about different local words like kafle, for example, that are used, for example, by Armenians in Diyarbakir, and we see that in Megerdich Margosyan's novels. Kafle, borrowed from Arabic, she said that it meant a caravan of people being marched away. Kafle was used by Armenians in Diyarbakir region who actually experienced deportations, as the word caravan portrays. But in mountainous Sassoon, people weren't deported. Many were instantly killed, hid in the mountains, or were adopted by birds, she said. Hence, they used the word ferman to reflect the idea of an ominous government order unleashed without mercy. Huri told me too that her community, the Armenians of Sassoon, also name subsequent waves of persecution. They talk about the genocide as the Birinci Ferman or Büyük Ferman, meaning first decree or the Great Decree for the 1915 events, and spoke of the second Ferman, ikinci Ferman, to describe forced relocations in the 1930s, known as the İskan Kanunu, or the Resettlement Law of 1934 into the 1940s. So putting forced migration of the 1930s in a linear sequence with the genocide reflects the way in which Huri and other Armenians of Sasson experienced and interpreted them. For them, the Armenian catastrophe has a much longer temporality than saying the genocide of 1915 to 1918 as a bounded historical event. What Huri's words reveal is that the genocide did not simply happen, it continues to unfold. Her vocabulary offers a window into the afterlives of genocide, where its violence reverberates across generations through language, law, memory, and forced migrations. Her grandparents faced annihilation, her parents endured forced displacement, and she herself lives with the weight of these histories, both inherited and ongoing in the present. As she puts it, quote, loyalty to the Agha, the village head, was central to Armenian survival in the region. After 1915, Armenians belonged to whoever saved them. We were lucky. We were saved by a good tribe, Ashiret. They became our owners. And she used a word in Arabic that is also in Turkish, the word sahib, that speaks of physical ownership. So the powerful words, they were our owners, underscoring how survival came at a cost, subjection to the local Kurdish tribe. They were no longer fully free to determine simple things like children's names, marriages, or even what religion they get to put on their official identity cards. She used the local word also nafi, which is Arabic for exile, and not the Turkish word sürgün. That speaks of this prolonged condition of forced displacement. In many instances, such a displacement without departure, a kind of estrangement while being in one's own land, what I call denativization. Huri didn't speak of 1915 as a single rupture, as often done in the diaspora and in academic writings. She spoke of multiple ferman, of an accumulated violence that pushed Armenians further from the possibility of belonging. In this sense, Huri's life offers a clear lens into denativization as an afterlife of genocide. Not a memory frozen in time, but a structure that continued to define where and how Armenians could live, worship, speak, or simply exist. Eventually, Huri told me that when her father died, she and her mother left Sasson for Istanbul out of fear of abduction, a fear that was far from unfounded in the region, the abduction of Armenian women and girls. Their departure was not just an escape from danger, but a crossing into a new layer of displacement. Coming to Istanbul was meant to be a kind of a refuge, but once in Istanbul, Huri encountered a different form of alienation, where some city-dwelling Armenians there perceived people like Huri as less Armenian, or not even Armenian, because they spoke a local dialect of Armenian mixed with Kurdish. Huri recalled the moment when she performed at a church event in Gedik Pasha in Armenian, and the organizer told the audience, "Look at our girl. She came speaking no Armenian, and now she speaks it fluently." She was taken aback and told him, "Well, I came to Istanbul speaking Sassoon Armenian and Kurdish. I came with no knowledge of Turkish." And then he replied back saying, "Well, but that Armenian is not really Armenian." In that moment, Huri experienced a double denativization. First, by the Turkish state that cast her as, on a good day, a tolerated minority, or treated her as a Kurd who was displaced under the different displacements of the Kurdish population of the region, and second, by fellow Armenians who treated her dialect and her identity as somewhat inauthentic. Her story shows how even within minoritized communities, hierarchies of legitimacy emerge. It also reveals how the afterlives of the genocide are internalized and not just imposed from the outside. Huri's story reveals how survival after genocide is layered, uneven, and deeply shaped by geography, language, and memory. While Armenians like her perceived local vocabulary like ferman and nafi that speaks directly to the state's violence, they also faced exclusion from within their own community, exposing how denativization fractures both identity and belonging. And yet, through recording her dialect of Sassoon, insisting on preserving the meaning of Sassoon Armenian, Huri enacts survivance, refusing erasure, and transforming silence into presence, pain into story, and memory into a living form of everyday endurance. If Huri's story shows us how denativization is spread in language, memory, and everyday exclusion, the story of Ara and his village, Everek, near Kayseri, shows how it is inscribed on the very landscape, on maps that erase, on buildings renamed, and cemeteries destroyed. I now turn to a different threads of the book from chapter 6 to explore how the afterlives of genocide endure not only through displacement of the living, but also through the forced removal of the dead. Ara's search for Everek and the impossibility of finding it under the name on the contemporary maps of Turkey offers a window into the ongoing erasure of Armenian presence and the state's attempt to recast Armenian life as something distant, foreign, or long gone. It is a reminder that denativization is not only a historical process, but an active one, and that those who remember and insist on naming what has been taken away enact a quiet but powerful form of survivance. Let me begin with that search, one that started over lunch in Alfortville, a suburb of Paris, where I did my field research, and led us into deep into the politics of map, memory, and bones. After the conversation with Ara over lunch in Alfortville, that the full story I invoke in chapter 3, I sought to locate his village, Everek, the contemporary map of Turkey. I found no trace of it. In those early months of fieldwork, I was not really aware of the geography of Armenian Anatolia and had difficulty locating places that people were telling me of. When I saw Ara next, I checked all possible spellings of the village's name with him and carried out further research. I still didn't find it. Finally, I went to Ara and told him that Ara does not exist. Shocked and distressed, he screamed at me. He said, "It exists," in French. I went back to the internet and again ran different searches and finally found a site with an Armenian map of the Kayseri region with key Armenian villages around it, published in Cairo in 1937. That site is dedicated to the Armenian heritage of the village of Efkere, and there I found the name Everek on the map, written in Armenian. It is just there with green, underlined in green. I was led to sites that say the city of Everek is now called Develi. The second was a Wikipedia article on Develi, which said that there is a 200-year-old Armenian church in the Everek quarter of Develi. Going back to Ara, I told him about my findings, and he insisted, however, that Everek was not in Develi and that Develi was a predominantly Muslim city, but a neighboring city. As was the case in many parts of Anatolia, the Republican regime has changed names, expanded cities to include neighboring villages alongside other measures to Turkify the landscape and erase indicators of local non-Turkish, that is, non-Muslim in a racialized sense, names, entities, villages, and neighborhoods that were rendered quote-unquote foreign. The same happened with the Armenian-built environment. Ara told me that the church of Everek, Surp Toros, or Saint Theodoros, the Armenian church in Everek, had been converted to the Fatih Jami, a mosque. It is notable that the name of the building was given when it became a mosque was Fatih, which is an Arabic word that means a conqueror for the Muslim faith, basically invoking the title of Sultan Fatih, Mehmed Fatih Sultan, who led the Count of Constantinople and converted Constantinople from the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore it is seen as a victory for the Muslim faith. So I just couldn't help but think about how the conquest of Constantinople has been reflected of the conquest of the Republican regime to Turkify and confiscate Armenian properties in a way that erases their presence. So denativization continued beyond the forced migration of Armenians and the conversion of their buildings to target also the bones of the dead in Everek. And this is, by the way, very interesting. There is an interesting story because when they were renovating the mosque, they found a fresco of the Virgin Mary there, and there was a debate. I'm actually writing an article about that. There was a debate in the Turkish media at the time that said, you know, do we demolish it so Muslim worshippers can pray without pictorial images, as the case with mosques? But then the Kayseri Heritage Department said that they need to be preserved. It needs to be preserved because it's part of the so-called heritage. But they don't tell us what heritage. They don't tell us that the church was Armenian. They don't tell us that this was used up until until the genocide. They don't tell us what's the story of building, and therefore it becomes somehow, it's a church with a pictorial representation that has completely divorced from its Armenian history and Armenian present and future. So toward the end of our meeting, Ara told me of another moment of destruction and displacement of his Everek. While the church still remains as a mosque, our cemetery was demolished in 1965. Armenians were forced to pick up the remains of dead and buried there and remove them to the Shishli cemetery in Istanbul. Ara demonstrates the ways in which the erasure of Armenian presence and memory in Everek was deliberate and extended beyond the displacement of the living. Not only were Armenians annihilated, those who remained pushed out of the land, but the Turkish state also sought to displace the deceased from their final resting place, to eliminate any visible reminders of the Armenian community's historical presence in the region. And when traces were found, they were made to speak of an ancient past or a temporally unidentified past, as the case with the debate around what to do with the frescoes. This process aimed to deny the violence and the destruction which the Republic of Turkey was founded, and to downplay the historical existence of Armenians in Anatolia. So if Everek reveals how Armenian presence is erased through renaming of villages and the displacement of the dead, the story of the church of Surp Khach in Akhtamar offers another layer of the same process, one that does not operate through demolition and conversion, but through selective preservation and symbolic appropriation. In both cases, the past is not simply obscured, it is actively rescripted and rewritten, where Everek Church is renamed as the Fatih Mosque, aligning it with conquest. Akhtamar Surp Khach is renovated and showcased as a symbol of Turkish multicultural tolerance. Yet both gestures serve a similar function. They remove Armenians from the present. This strategy became specifically clear in the state's promotional efforts, such as the September 2011 issue of the Turkish Airlines magazine, which featured Akhtamar Church on its cover. And I was flying on Turkish Airlines that September, and I took a copy of it. I still have it in my office. You know, to see an Armenian church on the cover of Turkish Airlines magazine was, you know, mind-blowing at the time. But after I finished my research, it really made sense why it was there. There, the monument is celebrated as a site of cultural heritage. Doesn't tell us what cultural heritage, it's simply Anatolian, yet entirely stripped of its Armenian specificity, framed instead with a politicized narrative of Anatolian diversity. By doing so, the state projects an image of inclusivity and preservation while diverting attention from the broader history of violence, destruction, and issue. If a discourse of tolerance served as one strategy of genocide denial, another strategy that has helped to perpetuate denialism is the use of carefully chosen language to avoid referring directly to the Armenian genocide. Of course, all of these are different iterations that I discuss in the book as different iteration as a process of denativization, where the church can be there on Turkish Airlines, a national symbol, yet the denativization happens through divorcing it of its Armenian context. Krikor, an Armenian from Istanbul who immigrated to France, lives in Paris in the 1970s, spoke of how denialism is embedded in the psyche of many Turkish intellectuals and explained that denialist discourse continues to be reproduced, disguised as acknowledgement, very much like what we see in the church of Ahtamar. He gave me an example of an email exchange with a Turkish journalist who is known to be somehow sympathetic to Armenians. In an article, the journalist used the Armenian expression "Medsi," great crime, to refer to the genocide, claiming that he was employing the same expression that Armenians use. So he didn't use soykırım, genocide, in Turkish. He translated the expression, the Armenian expression, to the Turkish word "büyük felaket," great catastrophe. Krikor wrote to him saying that the Armenian word "yegern" does not mean felaket, catastrophe or disaster, but rather it means jurum, a crime. Krikor continued, I did not argue about which word he used in Turkish, I just had an issue with mistranslation of the Armenian word. Yegern means a crime and not catastrophe. The journalist's response dismissed Krikor's point on translation. He said that it was too late to call it a crime, jurum, and that from now on, the meaning of the word would remain catastrophe. He told him in the email in Turkish, "Bu saatten sonra felaket jurum olmaz," as he worded it in the email. Casting doubt on the sincerity of this journalist who signed the 2008 apology campaign, I Apologize, Özür Diliyorum, on an initiative issued by Turkish civil society to apologize to Armenians, Krikor pointed out that he had been among the people who signed that initiative. It is notable that the mistranslation of the Armenian term "Medz Yegern" to mean catastrophe rather than crime provided a cunning way to address Armenian suffering without blaming the Turkish state as a perpetrator. Through the use of an expression rooted in Armenian language and history, it effectively removed the political charge from the genocide, evading direct implications or accusations toward the Turkish government as the sole responsible entity, consequently absolving the perpetrator of the crime. The text of the apology campaign reinforced the ambiguity employing the Turkish term "büyük felaket" that mirrors the mistranslation of the framing of the events of 1915 to basically circumvent direct acknowledgement of the genocide. Similarly, after Hrant-Dink's assassination, banners in his funeral read, "We are all Armenian," flooded the streets of Istanbul. While widely seen as an act of solidarity, this slogan, like the deliberate mistranslation of "Medz Yegern," also raises questions about whether it silenced the structural reality of genocide denialism in Turkey. For example, instead of calling for an end of denialism or denying accountability for the broader historical violence that culminated in Dink's murder, the slogan individualized the event, shifting the focus to identification rather than recognition of historical responsibility. In this sense, the assassin's act was not an isolated incident, but rather another iteration of the systematic pattern of violence against Armenians, sustained through both direct repression and historical erasure. The public response, however well-intended, I was there, risked further effacing the need for an explicit reckoning with Turkey's entrenched genocide denialism, which permeates both state institutions and society. Now this section, I call it enduring presence. Even in the face of forced migration, the renaming of cities, and the conversion of churches, and the displacement of the dead, Armenians continue to assert a presence that endures. From Ara's insistence that Everek still exists, to me finding the map published in 1937, to the refusal of monuments like Akhtamar to conform entirely to the narratives imposed upon them, though these stories remind us that erasure is never total. The title of my book, Enduring Erasures, carries the double meaning of endurance. It speaks both to the ongoing, relentless nature of erasure itself, the erasure that endures, and to the ways Armenians endure that erasure, by surviving it, resisting it, and refusing to be forgotten, their very survivance. Presence endures not just in buildings or names, but in the stubborn memories people carry, the stories we tell, the rituals we revive. What follows is a turn towards these acts of survival, not as triumphalist gestures, but a quiet, deliberate refusal to be erased. When discussing Hrant Dink's assassination with Krikor, he asked, why would a journalist, a member of a minority of less than 70,000 people, be regarded as a threat to a country of over 80 million? And why else would Dink's assassin regards his killing as an accomplishment, publicly declaring, after he shot him twice in his neck, that he killed the infidel with triumph? Krikor was adamant in telling me that the Armenian presence in Turkey is not a matter of numbers, civil rights, or even genocide recognition. He said, even if the few thousand remaining Armenians left Istanbul today, the Armenian will continue to constitute a threat. It is not a matter of statistics or logic, it's a state of mind, unquote. For him, Dink was assassinated because he posed a challenge to the Turkish establishment and to ordinary citizens who could not stand to hear an Armenian who refused assimilation, immigration, or to be silenced. Dink made the suppressed Armenian narrative of dispossession heard once more, bringing to the foreground the genocide not as an event of the past, but as an ongoing structure in the present. Yet even as the state aims to suppress this history, acts of refusal continue to emerge. Krikor, like many other Armenian citizens of Turkey, has always emphasized to me that Turkey is built on the ruins of Armenians. A statement that in itself stands as what I call in the book counter-history of the Turkish nation state, exposing its foundational violence and positioning annihilation and survivance, both annihilation and the survivance of Armenians, as new centers from which to conceive and retell Turkish Republican history. Counter-histories do not emerge simply by exposing the destructive foundation of the Turkish state, but by Armenians writing their own histories, reclaiming narratives, and asserting presence. These histories are not merely acts of remembrance, they are refusals to be erased, refusals to be confined to the past, dominated by the violence and dominated by the archives of the perpetrator. They subvert the silences imposed by the state, challenge its denials, and insist on a history that cannot be contained within nationalist amnesia. The struggle over history is not just about what has been lost, but also about what remains, what is continually restored, and those who refuse to disappear or be silenced. There are multiple sustained projects that I encountered when I was doing field work both in Turkey and in France that challenge the imposed silences. These projects are acts of refusal, are not merely personal gestures of remembrance, but of larger collective efforts that look beyond nostalgia, focusing instead on asserting future presence. For example, Terre et Culture, many of you may have heard of it, Land and Culture, was founded in France, was the first organization to conduct on-ground work restoring and preserving Armenian historical structures in Anatolia, Armenia, Artsakh, Syria, and Iran, ensuring that Armenian material heritage endures despite the systematic destruction of cultural sites. There is also Collective 2015, the Collectif 2015, that also emerged in France out of Land and Culture to mark the centennial of the genocide, challenging the foundational events of the Turkish state by demanding not only recognition, but they are demanding restitution and reparations, refusing to let dispossession be normalized. The organization emphasizes the need for acknowledgement of the genocide, but also the return of confiscated properties to the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul and the payment of reparation by the Turkish state. So it is not only about preserving the past, it is about what do we do about future. Similarly, the Turkey Cultural Heritage Map initiated by the Hrant Dink Foundation in Turkey documents thousands of Armenian, but also Rum, Syriac, and Jewish sites across Anatolia, transforming them into interactive spaces of storytelling. Through digital mapping, immersive media, and historical narratives, it uncovers the local history of buildings, neighborhoods, and villages. So, for example, if you go, and I discuss this in my article that I'm working on, the Sur Toros in Everek has a knowable history, unlike the way the Turkish media and the discussion in Turkish public discourse about. And we know its Armenian context and history through the Turkey Cultural Heritage Map. By inscribing on those maps the lived experiences of Armenians drawn from collective memory and historical sources. Each of these initiatives operate as an intervention against the logic of denativization, asserting that Armenians are not merely victims of historical violence, but active agents in shaping the future by reclaiming both their place on the land and their presence in history, therefore their survivance. This refusal to disappear echoes the struggle that Dink, who insisted that Armenians were not relics of the past, but part of Turkey's living fabric, and who envisioned a future where coexistence, not in a kind of liberal multicultural way, but through justice, where possible, a conviction for which he took his own life. But again, if it wasn't for his assassination, I tend to think I wouldn't have done this research, and maybe all of the projects and the work of the Hrant Dink Foundation wouldn't have existed, or maybe it did. It recalls the persistence of those who continue to demand justice despite state repression, those who return to ancestral villages to search for erased histories, and those who challenge nationalist mythologies that seek to overwrite Armenian belonging. Whether through the physical restoration, archival reconstruction, or digital mapping, these projects do more than counter the amnesia imposed by the Turkish state. They forge new pathways for Armenian presence, ensuring that memory is not just about preserving the past, are not just endeavors for nostalgia, but carried forward as a claim to the future. Now, this is the last section, is from my epilogue that I called an epilogue of return. Might be dense a little bit, but I just really, it's a dear 3 paragraphs to me, and this is how the book ends. So try to endure with me. Nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. Walter Benjamin once wrote, reminding us that history is not a settled record, but a constellation of fragments, scattered silence, waiting to be reanimated by those who refuse to forget and insist on telling their stories. This book has traced the endurance of erasure, but also the endurance of presence of Armenians who have survived not only physical destruction of genocide, but also the more pervasive violence of being rendered illegible within their own geography. And yet, despite it all, they remain. The soil remembers even when history forgets. Stories find their way even when no archive remains to hold them. The stories that once echoed through the narrow streets of Diyarbakir, Everek, Sassoon, and Mardin have not fully vanished. They persist in the worn inscriptions of forgotten churches, in the names whispered between generations, in the longing that shapes the stories the living continue to tell. For those who still, memory is not about looking back with remorse or nostalgia, but about remaining in the present and carrying themselves in the future, a way of being woven into the fabric of our daily lives, a refusal to let absence have the last word. It is in this space between remembrance and silence, between presence and erasure, that poetry stands as a counterpoint to forgetting, asserting the endurance of presence and survivance. I begin the book with an epigraph drawn from the poem History, Geography by the Armenian poet Karin Karakashlı. For many Armenians in and of Turkey, the assassination was not just of Denk was not just an act of violence against an individual, but an attempt to silence an entire community, its history, culture, and experience, but ultimately to deny them a future, perpetuating the genocidal violence that run through the very fabric of the Turkish Republic. This is why her last verse in the poem, she says, "I stayed in my geography within my life to write my own history," is a decisive proclamation of presence. It's a refusal to let the ongoing policies of erasure and narratives of denial authored by the state and its apologists claim the last word. For by being connected to their geography and among their dead, as she speaks throughout the poem, Armenians could articulate their own experience and write their own history, a history not centered on perpetrators or limited to victimhood. As this book draws to an end, we give the final word to the poet, whose voice rises above the din of erasure and silence. These words alert us to the fact that to be an Armenian in Turkey is not just a matter of historical record, but a reclamation of a past and a present that cannot be untangled from the geography of Anatolia itself. It is a declaration that despite attempts at silencing, despite the forces of assimilation or immigration, and despite the ongoing structure of denial and erasure, Armenian survivance is manifest through the very act of telling and retelling and continue to tell our stories. Storytelling is a refusal to yield to the pressures of forgetting and foregoing, a reclamation of space within narratives that is intrinsic to the reclamation of the lives lost on the land. Ultimately, storytelling is an assertion of presence, for in the midst of the perpetual loss, persistent denial, and protracted anxieties about the future, to say that I stay on my geography and to write my own history is not just to say I survive. It is to affirm that even in erasure, the dead bear witness and the living keep telling their stories. For history is never settled, and to assert presence is to insist that the past cannot be dictated by those who seek to justify or deny its crimes. As long as these stories are retold, the past remains unfinished, still waiting to be written. Each fragment of a story is a brushstroke on the canvas of history, not to complete the picture, but to disrupt its supposed clarity, to add depth where erasure sought to flatter, to reveal the layers that neat histories attempt to conceal. And in this layering, this act of storytelling, there is a return, but not to a place that once was, but to a presence that refuses to be erased. Thank you.
Thank you. What a fascinating presentation in terms of the way that he stated the erasure versus the continuation and the survivance. I'm going to open it up, ask if you have questions or would like to engage in conversation with Dr. Al-Rustom based on his talk. Is there anybody that would like to ask any questions or anyone? David? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. When you were talking, automatically I started comparing what you were saying with what is happening now in Artsakh in Azerbaijan. So do you see that sort of the same policy is kind of as if they borrow